Bartolina Sisa was born around 1750 in the Andean highlands of what is now Bolivia. From a young age, she moved with her family along the Altiplano trading coca leaves and woven goods, witnessing the injustices faced by her indigenous Aymara people under Spanish colonial rule. Her father, Jose Sisa, and mother Josefa Vargas raised her in a world of markets and mule paths, but also in a world of oppression, where indigenous lives and labor were exploited by the empire. In these early years, Bartolina learned more than commerce. She learned the value of solidarity, of listening to elders, of moving quietly through mountain passes. She learned that humiliation and violence were not natural but imposed, and that would become the spark of her destiny. As a young woman, Bartolina married Túpac Katari, a bold indigenous leader who would lead the greatest uprising the Andean region had seen prior to independence. Together they formed a partnership of resistance, of hope, of unyielding challenge to colonial authority. Bartolina did not simply support from behind the scenes. She became a strategist, a commander, a voice of a people rising again. In 1780 and 1781, as Aymara and Quechua communities across the Altiplano mobilized, Bartolina was present in the camps, in the organization of siege lines, in the decisions of war. She helped build the insurrection from the ground up. In March 1781, Bartolina and Túpac Katari initiated the siege of La Paz, then a Spanish colonial stronghold in Chile. They gathered tens of thousands of indigenous warriors and surrounded the city in its mountainous valley. Bartolina's role was critical. She organized military camps on the pass, ensured supply lines of food and coca leaves, coordinated communications between villages, and oversaw the political assemblies of indigenous leaders who declared their own autonomy. Under her leadership, the blockade lasted for over 5 months, at times reaching forces of 40,000 to 80,000 men and women. Within that time, the city felt the tension of hunger, isolation, and fear. Bartolina's leadership challenged colonial gender norms. Spanish records noted with astonishment that a woman stood at the head of rebel forces, organized councils, and refused to flee when the enemy approached. She traversed the Altiplano, visited remote canton villages, rallied women and men alike, and declared that indigenous blood and law would no longer be treated as expendable. For her people, she became not just a comrade in arms, but a symbol of what self-rule could feel like. Dignity, resistance, decision. But the Spanish Empire responded with familiar brutality. They brought reinforcements from Lima, La Plata, and Buenos Aires, launched campaigns of betrayal, negotiated false pacts, and turned indigenous groups against each other. Despite her efforts, Bartolina was betrayed, captured, and imprisoned. While in captivity, she was tortured and interrogated multiple times by colonial authorities, hoping to turn her into a collaborator. She refused to name her comrades. She refused to yield the dignity she had built for her people. On September 5, 1782, Bartolina Sisa was executed in La Paz. Her death was meant to be a spectacle. Dragged through the streets, humiliated, hung, and her body dismembered with her head and limbs displayed across regional villages as a warning. But what the Spanish thought would extinguish the flame only fueled its ember. Her memory ignited a legacy of resistance, of indigenous women rising, of communal decision-making, of the belief that colonial conquest did not have the final word. In the centuries that followed, Bartolina's name was reclaimed by indigenous movements, feminist scholars, peasant organizations, the National Union of Peasant Women in Bolivia, Confederación Nacional de Mujeres Campesinas Indígenas, originarias de Bolivia, Bartolina Sisa, was named in her honor, giving rural indigenous women political voice across the country. Since 1983, the International Day of Indigenous Women is commemorated on September 5th, the date of her death, reminding the world of her courage and the ongoing struggles of indigenous and rural women everywhere. Bartolina Sisa's accomplishments cannot be measured only in battles won or lost. Her real feat was in redefining what resistance could mean. She showed that cultural survival, community leadership, and gender equity could be central in an anti-colonial struggle. She fused her Aymara identity with military strategy and political infrastructure, protesting not only forced labor and tribute, but the silencing of native governance, language, and law. Under her hand camps were not just military sites, but forums of justice where indigenous leaders met, discussed, allocated resources, and made decisions collectively. She insisted that women be present in command and supply roles, that children and elderly be protected, that looting and chaos had no place in their ranks. She believed that the aim was not only to attack but to build, and in that building, she invited the women of her people to stand, to speak, to lead. She molded a resistance that carried together men and women, households and villages, and for that, she remains one of the few women in Latin American colonial history whose leadership matched, and in many ways, exceeded her male counterparts. Her legacy ripples in modern struggles. When indigenous communities resist mining projects in the Andes, when rural women demand land justice, when Bolivia rewrites its constitution to recognize indigenous sovereignty and gender parity, Bartolina's echo is in that movement. She holds space in memory, in ceremony, in protest banners, in the songs of peasant women who carry her name forward. The story of Bartolina Sisa teaches that colonial oppression is not inevitable, that land, language, and law can be reclaimed as long as the people are willing to stand. So when you tell the story of Bartolina Sisa, tell it not as a footnote, tell it as a beacon. A woman who rose from trade paths to military camps, who commanded armies, who sat at strategy councils, and who died publicly so that others might live freely. Her name is carved in mountain wind and rebel song. Her struggle did not begin in 1780, nor did it end with her execution. It continues today. Follow for more history they never taught us in school.